Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. For 39 years, a prince lived in shadow, a ghost within the walls of Topkapi Palace. Confined to a gilded prison known as the Kafes, the cage, he expected only death. But when the empire teetered on the brink of collapse, destiny came knocking. The doors of the cage were thrown open, and the forgotten prince, Suleiman II, was dragged into the light, a crown placed upon the head of a man who had known nothing but confinement. This is the story of a sultan forged in silence, who inherited a world on fire. In the heart of the Topkapi Palace, the epicenter of global power, there existed a silent, parallel world. It was not a world of statecraft or conquest, but of waiting. This was the Kafes, the cage. It was an innovation born of a terrible mercy, a gilded prison designed to replace the cold steel of the executioner's sword. For centuries, the Ottoman law of succession was brutally simple. The victor took the throne, and his brothers took the silk cord. To prevent civil war, fratricide was not just a crime of passion, it was an instrument of state, codified and expected. But the psychological toll, the endless cycle of kinslaying, became unbearable. Thus, the cage was built. Here, the spare heirs, the brothers of the reigning sultan, would live out their days. They were not killed, but they were not truly alive. They were ghosts haunting the palace corridors, their existence a state secret whispered in the shadows. The apartments were opulent, adorned with the finest silks, jewels, and Iznik tiles. Servants, all deaf mutes to prevent the leaking of secrets or the plotting of conspiracies, catered to every material need. Food was a feast, the baths were marble sanctuaries, and concubines were provided to ease the loneliness. But this luxury was a lie. It was the velvet lining of a steel trap. The windows were barred with intricate latticework, filtering the Istanbul sun into a pattern of imprisonment. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant call to prayer or the muffled sounds of a world they could never rejoin. For the princes within, every day was a gamble. They were safe from the bowstring, but not from madness. Decades of isolation, with no purpose but to wait for either the throne or a quiet, forgotten death, ate away at the soul. This was the world that awaited Shehzade Suleiman. He would enter it as a child and would not emerge for nearly 40 years, a man forged in silence and shadow. Before the cage, there was life. Shehzade Suleiman was born on April 15, 1642, into a world of absolute power and dizzying privilege. He was the son of Sultan Ibrahim, the ruler of an empire stretching across 3 continents, and his concubine, Saliha Dilashub Sultan. His first breaths were of palace air, scented with incense and the nearby sea. His first sounds were the rustle of silk and the murmur of courtly Turkish. In these early years, he was not a prisoner, but a prince, a potential heir to the throne of Osman. His childhood unfolded within the labyrinthine world of the imperial harem. This was not merely a place of sensual pleasure, but the political and domestic heart of the dynasty. It was a fiercely competitive arena where mothers, the Valide Sultans and the Hasekis, maneuvered to secure the future of their sons. Suleiman's mother, Saliha, would have guarded him fiercely, navigating the treacherous currents of court intrigue, knowing that her son's survival and her own status depended on it. He would have received the finest education available. Tutors would have instructed him in calligraphy, poetry, theology, and history, the history of his own family, a saga of glorious conquests and brutal betrayals. He would have learned of his namesake, Suleiman the Magnificent, and the weight of the legacy he carried. He played in the lush palace gardens, a boy like any other, yet utterly different. He was a piece in the great game of dynastic survival. For 6 short years, he knew a semblance of freedom. He was surrounded by his brothers, Mehmed, Ahmed, and others, playmates who were also his rivals. They were the sons of a sultan whose grip on sanity was loosening by the day, a storm gathering on the horizon that none of them could yet comprehend. This brief, sunlit chapter of his life was a fleeting dream, a memory he would have to cling to through decades of darkness, a reminder of a world that existed before the shadows fell and the doors of the Kafes closed behind him. To understand the fate of the sons, one must first understand the madness of the father. Sultan Ibrahim, Suleiman's father, ascended the throne in 1640 after spending 22 years in the Kafes himself. The experience had not fortified him, it had shattered him. He emerged from the darkness a broken man, plagued by crippling headaches, paranoia, and an insatiable appetite for sensual excess. His reign began with a semblance of order, guided by his mother, the powerful Kosem Sultan, and the Grand Vizier. But soon, Ibrahim's instability consumed the court. His rule descended into a theatre of the bizarre and the terrifying. He developed obsessions with ambergris, which he demanded be used in colossal quantities, and with enormous women, sending agents across the empire to find the most corpulent consorts for his harem. The treasury, already strained by war, was bled dry to fund his whims. He would cover entire rooms in expensive sable furs and shower his favorites with jewels, while the state teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. His moods were dangerously volatile. In a fit of rage, he nearly executed his own son and heir, Mehmed, hurling the child into a cistern and leaving him with a permanent scar. In his most infamous act of cruelty, fueled by a rumor of infidelity, he is said to have ordered his entire harem of nearly 300 women to be bound in sacks and drowned in the Bosphorus. Only one, saved by a passing ship, was rumored to have survived. For the young princes, including Suleiman, the palace was not a home, but a landscape of fear. Their father was not a protector, but the source of the terror. The janissaries, the ulama, and the highest officials of the state watched in horror as the Sultan's madness threatened to unravel the empire. They realized that the man on the throne was a greater danger than any foreign enemy. A choice had to be made. In 1648, the storm broke. Ibrahim was deposed in a swift and ruthless coup, and just days later, he was strangled. For his 6-year-old son, Suleiman, one prison was about to be exchanged for another. When the 6-year-old Mehmed IV was placed upon the throne after his father's execution, he inherited not only an empire, but also a terrible burden, the lives of his brothers. Among them was Suleiman, just a few months his junior. The young sultan was now the arbiter of their fate, the keyholder to their cage. This was a direct consequence of a seismic shift in Ottoman dynastic practice, a move away from a tradition soaked in blood. For nearly 150 years, the empire had operated under the law of fratricide, a chillingly pragmatic decree by Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror. It stated that whichever of his sons ascended the throne, it was acceptable for him to kill his brothers to ensure the order of the world. It was state-sanctioned murder to prevent the devastating civil wars that had plagued the early empire. Upon a sultan's death, his sons would race to the capital, and the first to be enthroned would send executioners to eliminate his siblings. It was a brutal Darwinian struggle that ensured a single, uncontested ruler. But the cost was immense. The dynasty consumed its own. Princes were strangled in their cradles. Brilliant minds were extinguished before they could flourish. The practice reached its grim apex, and finally, in the early 17th century, Sultan Ahmed I, haunted by the system that had forced him to contemplate the death of his own mentally unstable brother, Mustafa, broke the cycle. He spared Mustafa and introduced the Kafes as an alternative. It was seen as an act of enlightened mercy. But this mercy had its own price. It created a new kind of psychological torment. For Mehmed IV, a child ruler guided by his powerful grandmothers, the existence of his brothers was a constant, latent threat. Any faction at court, any rebellious pasha in a distant province, could use one of the caged princes as a figurehead for a coup. Their lives were spared, but their existence became a political liability. Mehmed bore the weight of this new tradition, the silent guardian of the gilded cage that held his own flesh and blood. a constant living reminder of the ghosts of their ancestors and the precarious nature of power. For 39 years, the world shrank to the size of a few opulent rooms. This was the Kafes, the gilded cage. When the heavy doors sealed behind the young Prince Suleiman in 1648, following the accession of his brother Mehmed IV, his life as a potential ruler ended, and his existence as a state secret began. The cage was not a dungeon of stone and iron, but a far more insidious prison of silk and gold. Sunlight streamed through intricate latticework, illuminating priceless carpets and walls adorned with exquisite Iznik tiles, depicting gardens he would never walk in. He was attended by deaf-mute servants, their silence a constant, unnerving reminder of his isolation. He was given books, encouraged to study calligraphy and the Quran, but every lesson was a double-edged sword. Knowledge was a window to a world he was forbidden from, a world where his brother, the Sultan, held the power of life and death over him. Every day was a mirror of the last. The call to prayer, the carefully prepared meals tasted first for poison, the lonely hours spent staring at the patterns on the wall. He was not entirely alone. His younger brother Ahmed shared his fate, a small comfort in a vast sea of uncertainty. But this shared confinement was also a source of terror. They were both loose ends, dynastic liabilities. The memory of their other brothers, executed by their grandmother Kosem Sultan, was a ghost that haunted the perfumed air of the cafes. Every footstep in the corridor, every unexpected summons, could be the arrival of the executioners with their silk bowstring. 39 years, nearly 4 decades of watching seasons change through a barred window, of hearing the distant sounds of a city he could not visit, of waiting for a death that could come at any moment, or a life that might never begin. How does a mind survive when it is entombed alive? For Suleiman, the gilded walls of the cafes were not just physical barriers, they were the frontiers of his sanity. The silence was his greatest tormentor and his only companion. In that profound quiet, the mind begins to feed on itself. Paranoia becomes a constant state of being. Every glance from a servant, every shift in the palace routine, became a potential omen of death. He learned to read the subtle language of fear, to exist in a state of hypervigilance that exhausted the soul. To cope, he retreated inward. The world outside was a source of terror, so the world within had to become a sanctuary. He dedicated himself to prayer and religious study with a fervor born of desperation. Faith was not an abstraction, it was a shield against the encroaching madness. The rhythmic recitation of the Quran, the meticulous practice of calligraphy, these were disciplines that imposed order on a life devoid of control. Yet, the psychological scars were inescapable. 39 years of imprisonment erodes ambition, dissolves confidence, and instills a deep, instinctual passivity. He was raised to be a potential emperor, a warrior, a leader of men. But the cafes taught him the opposite: to be invisible, to be silent, to want nothing, for to want was to invite danger. This was the paradox of his existence. To survive the cage, he had to kill the part of himself that was born to rule. He had to become the perfect prisoner, a man so broken and unassuming that he would never be perceived as a threat. The whispers in the walls were not just the echoes of the palace beyond, but the voices of his own fractured psyche, the ghosts of the man he might have been, and the terrifying silent prayers of the man he had become. While Suleiman languished in his gilded prison, the empire he was born to inherit was being consumed by fire. The reign of his brother, Mehmed IV, had reached its zenith and was now plummeting into a catastrophic decline. The catalyst was a grand, fatal miscalculation: the siege of Vienna in 1683. Led by the ambitious Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a colossal Ottoman army arrived at the gates of the Habsburg capital, convinced of a swift and glorious victory that would echo the conquests of their ancestors. But the dream of conquest turned into a nightmare. A relief army led by the Polish king, John III Sobieski, shattered the Ottoman lines. The defeat was not just a military loss, It was a psychological blow from which the empire would not easily recover. It signaled a seismic shift in the balance of power in Europe. The triumphant Christian powers formed a holy league: the Habsburg Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Republic of Venice, and later Russia. They launched a coordinated, relentless counteroffensive known as the Great Turkish War. The tide of history, which had carried the Ottomans to the heart of Europe, now violently reversed. The legendary fortresses of Hungary, held for over a century and a half, began to fall one by one. The unthinkable happened in 1686. Buda, the jewel of Ottoman Hungary, was lost after a brutal siege. A year later, at the Second Battle of Mohacs, the Ottoman army was utterly routed, a humiliating reversal of the famous victory won by Suleiman the Magnificent. As news of each disaster reached the capital, the foundations of Mehmed IV's throne began to crack. The empire was bleeding territory, treasure, and its most precious resource, its aura of invincibility. The flames of war on the frontiers were about to ignite a political firestorm in Constantinople. Sultan Mehmed IV was known as Avcı, the Hunter. It was a title he earned through his all-consuming passion for the chase, a passion that came to symbolize his fatal detachment from the duties of the throne. While his armies were being slaughtered on the plains of Hungary, and his treasury was being bled dry, the Sultan was often deep in the forests of Thrace, hunting stag and boar. His neglect was no longer a private failing, it was a state liability. The breaking point came after the disaster at Mohacs in 1687. The army, what was left of it, mutinied. They were unpaid, starving, and utterly demoralized. They had faced the enemy's steel while their sultan chased game. Their rage was incandescent. Led by their commanders, the disgruntled troops turned their backs on the front and began the long march to the capital. This was not a mere protest. It was an armed rebellion aimed at the very apex of power. Panic gripped the Topkapi Palace. Mehmed, finally shaken from his aristocratic lethargy, made desperate concessions. He executed his hated Grand Vizier, Sultan Suleiman Pasha, offering him up as a scapegoat. But it was too little, too late. The army wanted more than a vizier's head. They wanted a new sultan. In the capital, the high-ranking officials of the Divan and the senior ulama, the religious establishment, saw the writing on the wall. Supporting a failed sultan against a vengeful army was political suicide. In a tense, secret meeting, they issued a fatwa declaring Mehmed IV unfit to rule. His obsession with the hunt at the expense of his people and his faith was his undoing. The hunter had become the hunted. The decision was made. They would go to the one place a new sultan could be found. They would go to the Kafes. The fate of the empire now rested on opening a door that had been sealed for 39 years. November 8, 1687. A day of reckoning in Istanbul. The empire, the seemingly eternal state, was convulsing. The catastrophic defeat at the Second Battle of Mohacs had not just been a military disaster, it was a verdict on the reign of Mehmed IV. The Janissaries, the once unflinching spine of the Ottoman army, were now a raging mob marching on the capital. They had tasted humiliation on the battlefield and now craved vengeance in the palace. Their demand was absolute. The Sultan must fall. Inside the opulent but terrified confines of the Topkapi Palace, the high officials of the Divan understood their position was untenable. To save the empire, and perhaps their own lives, they had to sacrifice the sovereign. Their decision led them down a shadowy corridor to a gilded prison known as the Kafes, the cage. Here, for 39 years, lived Shehzade Suleiman, a forgotten prince, a man whose entire existence had been a prelude to a death that never came. Since the age of 6, he had been confined, watching the world through latticed windows, his only certainty the daily arrival of food and the constant gnawing fear that one day assassins would arrive instead. He had seen his brothers and nephews led to their deaths by the silken bowstring, the grim tradition of fratricide that haunted the house of Osman. Now, as he heard the heavy footsteps and the grating of the lock, He surely believed his time had come. At 45 years old, the prince prepared to meet his end. The door swung open. But instead of executioners, he saw the highest dignitaries of the state. They did not carry a bowstring. They knelt. In that moment of profound, terrifying disbelief, the world inverted. The prisoner of the cage was being hailed as the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth. The man who had known nothing but gilded walls and the scent of fear was being summoned to save an empire on the very brink of annihilation. Destiny had not forgotten him. It had merely waited for the moment of greatest desperation. The accession of a sultan was meant to be a spectacle of absolute power, a glorious ceremony solidifying the divine order. For Suleiman II, it was a waking nightmare. Thrust from the silent solitude of the Kafes into the heart of a political tempest, he was less a ruler than a sacrificial figure. The empire he inherited was not a prize, it was a poisoned chalice. The Holy League, a formidable alliance of European powers, was carving through the Balkans, seizing fortresses and cities that had been Ottoman for centuries. The treasury was not just empty, it was deeply in debt. And the army, the very instrument of imperial will, was in open mutiny, its soldiers rampaging through the streets of Istanbul, looting and lynching officials they blamed for their defeat and lack of pay. Suleiman himself was a man profoundly broken by his past. Decades of isolation had instilled in him a deep piety and a gentle nature, but they had also stripped him of the ruthlessness and political acumen required to rule. He was hesitant, overwhelmed, and psychologically scarred. His first act as sultan was to promise the traditional accession donative, the kulus bahshishi, to the soldiers who had put him on the throne. It was a promise he could not keep. When the treasury was found to be barren, the soldiers' fury intensified. The new sultan, who they hoped would be their savior, was just as powerless as the old one. He was a prisoner once more, not in the cage, but on the throne itself. The weight of the Ottoman crown, a symbol of dominion over 3 continents, felt to him like a crown of thorns, each jewel a reminder of a crisis he was utterly unequipped to solve. He was a devout man in a godless situation, a gentle soul tasked with commanding a storm he could not control. As the empire spiraled towards utter collapse, with enemies at the gates and anarchy within, a desperate search began for a man who could reverse the tide. The state had cycled through a series of inept and corrupt grand viziers, each failing more spectacularly than the last. In this moment of supreme crisis, all eyes turned to a single name, a name that echoed with the memory of salvation: Köprülü. The Köprülü family had, decades earlier, produced a dynasty of brilliant and iron-willed statesmen who had rescued the empire from a similar abyss. Their name was a promise of order, discipline, and victory. The man who now carried that legacy was Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha. Fazıl Mustafa was everything the current leadership was not. He was a man of unimpeachable integrity, renowned for his military skill, administrative genius, and austere piety. He had watched the decay from a distance, refusing to serve in a corrupt government. Now, the government came to him. In a move born of sheer desperation and surprising wisdom, Sultan Suleiman II, the man paralyzed by indecision, made the most decisive choice of his reign. He summoned Fazıl Mustafa Pasha and offered him the grand seal of the empire. This was not merely an appointment, it was a plea. Suleiman, keenly aware of his own inadequacies, was prepared to cede near absolute authority to the one man who might be able to wield it effectively. Fazıl Mustafa accepted, but on his own stark terms. He demanded a free hand, the power to purge the government and the army, to enact sweeping reforms without interference, and to prosecute the war as he saw fit. It was an audacious gamble, placing the fate of the entire Ottoman world into the hands of one man. For Sultan Suleiman II, it was the only move he had left. What followed was one of the most remarkable and unconventional partnerships in Ottoman history. An alliance was forged not of ambition or friendship, but of grim necessity. On one side stood Sultan Suleiman II, the reclusive, deeply religious monarch haunted by a lifetime of confinement, a man who found solace in calligraphy and prayer, not politics and war. On the other stood Grand Vizier Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, the dynamic, unyielding reformer, a whirlwind of action and iron resolve. It was a union of the spiritual and the temporal, the withdrawn sovereign and the proactive statesman. Suleiman, in an act of profound self-awareness, understood that his greatest contribution to the empire was to step aside. He provided the ultimate authority, the imperial legitimacy that only a sultan could confer, and then entrusted the execution of that authority entirely to his Grand Vizier. This trust was absolute. While Fazıl Mustafa launched his radical and often brutal reforms, Suleiman provided the unwavering royal sanction. The Grand Vizier moved with lightning speed. He instituted a comprehensive fiscal overhaul, creating a new budget and cracking down on the tax farming that had bled the provinces dry. He purged corrupt officials and incompetent commanders from the army, replacing them with men of merit. He reinstilled a terrifying discipline into the Janissary corps, ending the chaos in the capital. He reformed the poll tax on non-Muslims, earning their loyalty at a critical time. Throughout this whirlwind of activity, Suleiman remained in the palace, a still point in the turning world, his quiet piety giving a moral weight to the vizier's harsh measures. The sultan's weakness, his lack of worldly ambition and political experience, had paradoxically become the empire's greatest strength. He had found the right man for the crisis and possessed the rare wisdom to let him save them all. Suleiman II did not ascend to a throne of gold and silk, but to one of fire and steel. The very men who had placed him there, the Janissaries, were the greatest threat to his rule. Having tasted the power to unmake a sultan, they believed they could control his successor. The capital, Istanbul, was a cauldron of their making. They swarmed the streets, their demands echoing through the palace gates, a king's ransom in accession bonuses, the heads of officials they despised, and the freedom to loot and terrorize. For a man who had spent 4 decades in the gilded silence of the Kafes, this explosion of sound and violence was a living nightmare. He was a scholar, a calligrapher, a man of quiet contemplation, now thrust into the heart of a political hurricane. The early days of his reign were marked by a terrifying paralysis. The treasury was empty, plundered by the rebels, and the government was powerless. The Janissaries, the supposed protectors of the Sultan, were holding the empire hostage. But within the quiet Sultan, a flicker of his ancestors' resolve remained. He made a decision that would define his reign, appointing Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha as his Grand Vizier. This was no ordinary appointment. Fazıl Mustafa was the scion of a dynasty of iron-willed administrators. He arrived in the capital, not with promises, but with an axe. With Suleiman's absolute backing, the new Grand Vizier began a systematic purge. He paid the Janissaries their due, but on his terms, using newly minted currency. Then, he moved with chilling precision. The ringleaders of the revolt were identified, hunted down, and executed without ceremony. He disbanded rogue units, enforced discipline with an iron fist, and reminded the corps that their purpose was to serve the state, not to rule it. The fire that had threatened to consume the empire was not extinguished, but brought back into the forge, hammered and reshaped into a weapon the state could once again wield. With the Janissaries brought to heel, Grand Vizier Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, acting as the Sultan's unyielding hand, turned his attention to the empire's true sickness, its empty coffers. Decades of war, corruption, and mismanagement had bled the treasury dry. The state was not merely poor, it was bankrupt, unable to fund the armies needed to defend its borders from the encroaching Holy League. Fazıl Mustafa understood a profound truth. Military might is forged not just in foundries, but in the ledgers of the treasury. He unleashed a wave of reforms so radical they shook the foundations of the Ottoman bureaucracy. His primary target was the tax system, a labyrinth of inefficiency and exploitation. He courageously reformed the jizya, the poll tax on non-Muslim subjects. previously levied on entire communities, it was often collected by corrupt local notables who extorted the populace. Fazıl Mustafa abolished this system, instituting a fairer, per-head tax collected directly by state officials, cutting out the parasitic middlemen. This not only increased state revenue dramatically, but also offered a measure of protection to the empire's Christian and Jewish subjects, earning the vizier the moniker, the virtuous. He then declared war on corruption within the state itself. Officials who had grown fat on bribes and embezzlement found their wealth confiscated and their careers, or lives, terminated. New copper and silver coins were minted to stabilize the currency, and a comprehensive budget was drafted, scrutinizing every expense. For the first time in years, a sense of fiscal discipline was imposed upon the sprawling imperial machine. These were not mere administrative tweaks. This was emergency surgery on a dying patient, performed with ruthless skill under the watchful eye of a sultan, who knew that without gold, the sword was useless. The financial reforms were a desperate necessity, for beyond the walls of Istanbul, the wolves were circling. The Great Turkish War raged on, a catastrophic conflict that had seen the Ottomans pushed back across the Danube. The Holy League, a formidable alliance of the Habsburg Empire, Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and an ascendant Russia, was relentlessly pressing its advantage. The loss of Buda in 1686 had been a psychological shock. The fall of Belgrade in 1688 was a strategic disaster, opening the heart of the Balkans to Austrian invasion. For Sultan Suleiman II, the news from the front was a relentless tide of defeat. From his gilded cage, he had only heard whispers of these far-off battles. Now, as Padishah, their consequences were his to bear. The empire was fighting for its very existence. While Venice attacked in Greece and Poland threatened the northern frontiers, the main theatre of war was the brutal, bloody struggle against the Habsburgs in Hungary and Serbia. With the treasury slowly refilling and the army's discipline restored, Grand Vizier Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha prepared to counterattack. He was not merely an administrator, but a warrior, embodying the classical Ottoman ideal of the sword and the pen. In 1690, he took personal command of the army. This was no ceremonial role. He marched with his men, shared their hardships, and led them from the front. The objective was audacious: to reclaim what was lost, to drive the Austrians back across the Danube. The campaign was a stunning success. Niš, Smederevo, and, most symbolically, the fortress of Belgrade were all recaptured by the Ottoman forces under the Grand Vizier's brilliant command. A wave of relief and renewed hope swept through the empire. It seemed the tide was turning, that the lion of the Ottomans, guided by its wise sultan and his iron vizier, had roused itself from its slumber. The victories of 1690 were a powerful statement, but they were not decisive. The Habsburg war machine, led by the brilliant and ruthless commander Louis William, the Margrave of Baden-Baden, was far from broken. In the summer of 1691, the two great armies once again converged near the confluence of the Danube and Tisza rivers at a place called Slankamen. The fate of the Balkans, and perhaps the empire itself, would be decided here. Grand Vizier Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, the architect of the Ottoman revival, commanded a massive force, but he was facing a tactically superior and well-entrenched enemy. The battle, fought on August 19th, was a brutal and chaotic affair. The Ottoman forces launched fierce attacks against the Habsburg lines, with the Janissaries displaying the renewed discipline their vizier had instilled in them. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance, a maelstrom of cannon fire, musket volleys, and desperate cavalry charges. The Margrave of Baden, seeing his left flank begin to crumble, ordered a desperate all-out assault on the Ottoman centre, targeting the command post of the Grand Vizier himself. It was the battle's critical moment. True to his warrior ethos, Fazıl Mustafa was not directing the battle from the rear. He was in the thick of the fighting, rallying his troops, a beacon of defiance. As the imperial cavalry crashed into his position, he refused to yield. He drew his sword and plunged into the fray, fighting alongside his personal guard. In that vortex of violence, a stray bullet found its mark. The Grand Vizier, the virtuous, the man who had tamed the Janissaries, rebuilt the treasury, and reclaimed Belgrade, fell dead from his horse. His death shattered the Ottoman morale. Leaderless and confused, their command structure collapsed, and the army broke into a panicked retreat. The Battle of Slankamen was a catastrophic defeat, but it was also a legend. It was the final, heroic stand of a Grand Vizier who gave his life for the empire, a tragic end to a brilliant career and a devastating blow from which Suleiman II's reign would never truly recover. The year is 1690. The Ottoman war machine, once the terror of Christendom, is battered and bleeding. Defeat has become a bitter habit. In the opulent halls of Edirne Palace, a decision is made that sends a shockwave through the empire. Sultan Suleiman II, the man who had spent nearly 4 decades as a prisoner in the gilded cage, announces his intention to lead the army himself. This was an act of profound, almost reckless courage. For generations, sultans had commanded from the comfort of the capital, their presence on the battlefield a distant memory of a more glorious age. But Suleiman was different. He was not forged in the crucible of provincial governorship or military command. He was forged in silence and shadow. Yet, he understood a fundamental truth. The morale of his army was shattered, and only the presence of the caliph, the Padishah himself, could hope to mend it. Imagine the scene. The man who had known only the confines of a few lavish rooms now rides at the head of a vast, sprawling army. The air, once thick with the scent of perfume and incense, is now filled with the dust of the march, the smell of horses, and the metallic tang of steel. He was no military genius, no Selim the Grim or Murad IV. He did not charge into the fray, sword in hand. His role was more vital. He was the living embodiment of the state, the sacred symbol of Ottoman legitimacy. He presided over war councils, his quiet, considered judgment lending weight to the strategies of his Grand Vizier, Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha. He ensured provisions reached the troops, that justice was dispensed in the military camps, and that the spirit of jihad was rekindled not through hollow proclamations, but through his own pious, unwavering presence. He oversaw the recapture of Belgrade, a monumental victory that momentarily turned the tide against the Holy League. The caged prince had become the warrior sultan, proving that the resolve to rule was not extinguished by the darkness of the Kafes, but perhaps was refined by it. While the sultan projected an image of stoic resolve to his army and his court, the knights were a different matter. The past is not a country one can simply leave behind, and for Suleiman II, it was a haunted, ever-present landscape. 39 years in the Kafes had etched deep lines, not only on his face, but upon his soul. In the quiet of his campaign tent, or the solitude of his palace chambers, the ghosts of his confinement would return. Every unexpected sound, every shadow that danced in the flickering candlelight, could have been a premonition of the executioner's silent approach, a fear he had lived with every single day for 4 decades. The faces of his brothers, Ahmed and the deposed Mehmed, would have swum in his memory. He had survived them, but survivor's guilt is a unique and corrosive poison. His extreme piety, his deep devotion to Islamic law and mysticism, was more than just a matter of faith. It was his sanctuary. Prayer was his shield against the paranoia that was the birthright of every caged prince. He poured his energy into acts of public good, reforming finances, ensuring justice, perhaps as a way to atone for the bloody system that had placed him on the throne, a system built on the necessity of fratricide. He was a man ruling an empire, yet in many ways, he was still a prisoner. He was shackled to his memories, to the psychological trauma that could not be undone by a crown or a sword. This internal conflict defined his character. He was both the absolute monarch, the shadow of God on earth, and the trembling inmate, forever looking over his shoulder. This duality made him cautious, thoughtful, and deeply empathetic to the suffering of his subjects, but it also robbed him of the arrogance and unchecked ambition that had characterized so many of his predecessors. He ruled not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the heavy heart of a man who knew, intimately, the price of power. The campaign of 1690 was a triumph, but a Pyrrhic one for the Sultan himself. The man who emerged from the Kafes was in his late 40s, his body unaccustomed to hardship. Decades of forced inactivity had left him physically frail, a stark contrast to his iron will. The brutal realities of a military campaign, the harsh weather, the rough travel, the constant stress, took a devastating toll. He returned to his palace in Edirne, not as a conquering hero reborn, but as a man whose life force was draining away. Soon after his return, the symptoms began. His body began to swell, a clear sign of dropsy, or what we would today call severe edema, likely stemming from kidney failure. The condition was relentless. The physicians of the palace, with their potions and prayers, were powerless against the systemic collapse of his health. The irony was tragic and profound. He had survived the bowstring, the poison, and the psychological torment of the cage for 39 years. He had escaped the fate of his brothers and ascended to the throne, initiating a period of desperate, much-needed reform. He had faced the armies of the Holy League and restored a measure of pride to his empire. Yet, in the end, it was not an assassin's blade that struck him down, but his own failing body, broken by the very duty he had so bravely embraced. His reign, which had begun with such unexpected vigor, was now rapidly drawing to a close. As the winter of 1691 descended, the Sultan was largely confined to his bed, his great work left unfinished. The halls of the palace grew quiet, the frantic energy of reform replaced by the somber whispers of an impending succession. The caged lion had roared, but his strength was spent. The end was near, a quiet, painful fading away for a man who had lived most of his life in silence. On June 22nd, 1691, after a reign of less than 4 years, Sultan Suleiman II died. He was succeeded by his brother, Ahmed II, another prince who had spent a lifetime in the Kafes. History often relegates Suleiman II to a footnote, a brief placeholder between the disastrous reign of his brother Mehmed IV and the continued struggles of the late 17th century. He is the forgotten sultan, overshadowed by the powerful grand viziers who served him. But this assessment is a profound injustice. To understand his legacy, one must look not at the length of his reign, but at its impact. He inherited an empire on the verge of total collapse, its armies in retreat, its treasury bankrupt, its currency worthless, and its people in despair. In just 46 months, the situation was dramatically altered. Suleiman II was no mere puppet of the Köprülü family. He was their essential partner. It was his unwavering trust and royal authority that empowered Fazıl Mustafa Pasha to enact his sweeping reforms. It was Suleiman who approved the crackdown on corruption, the stabilization of the currency, and the overhaul of the tax system to protect the peasantry. It was his personal decision to march with the army that provided the critical morale boost needed to reclaim lost territories. He was the anchor that held the ship of state steady while his vizier frantically repaired the hull. His legacy is one of quiet, determined competence. He demonstrated that a ruler's effectiveness is not measured in battles won or monuments built, but in the stability and justice they provide for their people. He proved that even a life seemingly stolen by imprisonment could be redeemed by a fierce commitment to duty. The caged lion did not rule for long, but he ruled well, providing a crucial, stabilizing bridge in a time of chaos. He was not a conqueror, but a restorer, not a revolutionary, but a reformer, the forgotten sultan who saved his empire from the brink.